The door closed behind him. The click of the lock was a gunshot in the deafening silence of his small apartment. Axel didn't move, his back pressed against the cold wood. In the center of his living room, on his favorite rug, stood the creature he had despised and feared since childhood, a mass of coiled muscle beneath a smooth, brindle coat. A broad head with powerful jaws that, he imagined, could easily snap the leg of a chair. A pair of small, white scars on its muzzle, evidence of a past Axel didn't even want to consider. It was a pit bull, and for the next few days it would be living here, with him. His name was Bane, a name that struck Axel as a cruel joke. He clutched the old, worn leash in his hand as if it were the pin of a grenade. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, inhaling the unfamiliar scents of his home, its dark, impenetrable eyes scanning the surroundings. It didn't growl, it didn't bark, and that silence was worse than any snarl. It was the silence of a predator assessing its territory, the silence of a steel spring ready to uncoil at any moment. Just an hour ago, he had been calmly sipping his morning coffee when the phone rang. The trembling voice of Mrs. Peterson's daughter, his elderly neighbor from the third floor. A heart attack, the hospital, an emergency. And then the desperate, tearful plea, "Axel, please, you're the only one. There's nowhere for Bane to go, the shelters won't take him, and he won't survive alone. Just for a couple of days, I'm begging you." Axel hated himself for agreeing. He had hissed yes into the phone because he couldn't refuse a woman in that situation. Because Mrs. Peterson had once watched his plant while he was on vacation. A stupid, idiotic plant. Now, his home was occupied not by a plant, but by a killing machine ripped from the newspaper headlines he so loved to read. He remembered all the stories, all the bite statistics, all the blood-curdling reports. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, he went to the kitchen and poured water into the bowl the daughter had given him. He placed it on the floor, at a safe distance. Bane didn't even flinch. He continued to stand in the center of the room like a monument to someone else's carelessness. Axel retreated to the farthest corner and sat in his armchair. They watched each other. Or rather, Axel watched the dog. The dog watched something beyond him, into the void. An hour passed, then another. The sun shifted, and a strip of light fell across the dog's face, highlighting another scar, this one above his eye. Axel felt like a hostage in his own home. He didn't dare turn on the TV, afraid the sudden noise would provoke the beast. He was afraid to stand up to go to the bathroom. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a challenge. By evening, the tension was unbearable. The dog still hadn't touched the water. It slowly circled the room, sniffing the corners, and finally lay down by the front door. Not on the soft rug, but on the cold linoleum. It lay there, head on its paws, and stared at the door. It wasn't sleeping, it was waiting. Late that night, as Axel lay in his bed listening to every rustle, he heard it. A quiet, barely perceptible sound. A whimper, thin, plaintive, and so full of longing that a shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't the growl of a monster. It was the cry of a lost child. He got up carefully and tiptoed to his bedroom door. In the sliver of light from the window, he saw Bane. The dog was in the same position, but his body was trembling slightly, and he was whimpering, almost silently, staring at the door behind which his owner had disappeared. Axel froze. He had been looking at the dog's jaws, at its muscles, at its reputation, and for the first time all day, he saw something else. Next to Bane's massive paw lay an old, slobbery toy that must have come with the leash. A squeaky rubber hedgehog with one eye missing. And in that deafening silence, for the first time, Axel truly looked at Bane. And he didn't see a monster. He saw only a boundless, all-consuming loneliness. That mournful sound broke the spell of his fear. It was a language he understood, though he didn't want to admit it. The language of loss. He knew it all too well himself, and the thought made him push away his own unwelcome memories. This wasn't about him. The water bowl was still by the wall, untouched, a silent monument to his own fear, a pathetic offering made from a safe distance. Now, it seemed almost insulting. He took a slow breath. And another. He mentally called himself an idiot. A grown man, paralyzed by an animal's grief. Slowly, deliberately, he took one step out of the bedroom, then another. The floorboards didn't creak, but a deafening crack echoed in his head. Bane's whimpering stopped instantly. His head shot up. The dark eyes that had seemed so empty were now locked onto Axel. Every muscle in the dog's body tensed, ready for action. The air crackled. The fragile moment of connection vanished, replaced by the old familiar tension. "Don't stop," Axel told himself. He walked to the bowl, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. He moved slowly, like a sapper approaching an unexploded mine. He stopped a few feet from the dog and carefully placed the ceramic bowl on the floor, much closer than the first time. He didn't say a word. He just nudged it forward with the tip of his finger, and the sound of ceramic sliding on linoleum seemed deafening. Bane didn't move. He just looked at Axel's hand, then shifted his gaze to his face. It was a long, heavy stare, a silent negotiation where something important was being decided. Then the dog blinked slowly. Once! He let out a quiet, deep sigh, and his head sank back onto his paws. He didn't drink, but he was no longer looking at the door. He was looking at the bowl. Axel retreated just as slowly. Back in his armchair, he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. It was ridiculous. He hadn't done anything, but it felt as if he had crossed a chasm. The monster in his living room had vanished. In its place was just a dog named Bane who missed his owner and, it seemed, was finally considering the possibility of a drink. And for the first time in long hours, the silence in the apartment didn't feel threatening. It felt shared. Morning came not with an alarm clock, but with an anxious, nagging thought. The dog. Axel opened his eyes and lay still for a few seconds, listening to the silence. It was different, not dead, not tense, just quiet. He got up carefully and peered into the living room. Bane was in the same spot by the door, but something had changed. The water bowl was empty. Something in Axel's chest loosened, as if a tightly wound knot had been eased. He hadn't seen when the dog decided to drink, but he had. It was a tiny but real step out of the icy cocoon of grief. A silent sign of acceptance. The next barrier, food. Axel found a heavy paper bag of kibble in the kitchen. The sound of the dry food rattling into the bowl was loud and foreign in this quiet kingdom. Bane's head lifted immediately. His nostrils flared, catching the familiar scent. This time, he didn't just look. He watched Axel's every move with a clear, genuine interest. Axel repeated yesterday's ritual. He walked slowly into the living room and placed the food bowl on the floor, in roughly the same spot where he'd left the water. Then he retreated just as slowly to the armchair that had become his observation post. They watched each other again. But now, it wasn't a battle of wills. It was an expectation. Bane's gaze flickered from Axel to the bowl, then back to Axel. This went on for about a minute. Then, as if satisfied that the man wasn't going to approach, he rose slowly, almost reluctantly. His joints made a soft popping sound. He walked to the food, sniffed it, and only then began to eat. The sound of crunching kibble filled the apartment. It was the most ordinary, most peaceful sound in the world. The sound of life going on, even when your world has collapsed. Axel didn't take his eyes off him. He suddenly noticed how neatly the dog ate, not scattering the food. He noticed the slight twitch of his ear as it reacted to a distant siren outside. For the first time, he saw Bane not as a symbol or a threat, but just as a dog. A large, sad dog, but one whose basic needs were completely understandable. And the next need was unavoidable. A walk. The thought sent another chill down Axel's spine. The apartment was his territory, a controlled space. The street was chaos. Other people, other dogs, children, cars. He picked up the leash, and his palm was instantly damp. This piece of braided nylon was the physical bridge between him and the creature he still subconsciously feared. He approached Bane, who had finished eating and was staring at him again. "Well, buddy, time to go." Axel asked quietly, surprised by the sound of his own voice. Bane didn't answer, but when Axel showed him the leash, the dog stood up. His body wasn't tense. It was ready. He knew this object. He knew what it meant. The most terrifying moment. Axel crouched down to clip the carabiner to the collar. He was so close he could feel the warmth radiating from the dog's body and see the dust motes on his short fur. His fingers touched the cold metal ring. He braced for anything, a growl, a flinch, tensed muscles. But he got nothing, absolutely nothing. Bane just stood there, his head patiently bowed, allowing a stranger to touch his most vulnerable spot. He clicked the carabiner shut, and that sound, unlike yesterday's click of the lock, sounded like a beginning, not an end. Axel rose slowly, holding the leash. They stood at the door, together, two lonely beings, ready to step out into a world that had just robbed them both of a piece of their peace. The air in the hallway was stale and still. It felt 1,000 times more cramped with Bane in it. Axel held the leash as if it were a live wire, ready to deliver a shock at any second. He expected a pull, a tug, an attempt to dominate. But Bane just walked beside him. His gait was measured, almost regal. He didn't pull, he didn't lunge. He walked with a dignity, as if strolling down the dreary apartment corridor was an important and meaningful mission. They stepped outside. The city assaulted them with a torrent of sounds and smells. The roar of a bus, the screech of brakes, the aroma of coffee from the nearby bakery, and the sharp scent of exhaust fumes. Axel tensed, waiting for a reaction. Bane merely flicked his ears, calmly sniffed the air, and continued on his way. He did his business at the base of a scraggly tree with an air of deep concentration, then looked up at Axel as if to ask, "What's next?" Axel didn't know. He just led the dog down the sidewalk, avoiding pedestrians. He could feel their stares. People crossed to the other side of the street. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. He saw their reaction, their fear, a reflection of his own. And for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like a confirmation, but a dull annoyance. And then it happened. From around the corner came Mrs. Gable from the apartment across the hall. And on her leash, Pixel, her Yorkshire Terrier, a tiny yapping ball of fur with an oversized ego. Upon seeing Bane, Pixel let out a piercing bark that could have shattered glass and lunged forward, straining the leash to its limit. Mrs. Gable gasped. She recoiled, clutching her trembling little dog to her chest, and looked at Bane with poorly concealed horror. "Be careful," she hissed, as if Axel were walking a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Everything inside Axel clenched. He was ready for Bane to leap, ready for the snarl, the retaliatory aggression. He gripped the leash so tightly his knuckles turned white. But Bane did nothing. He stopped. He glanced down for a moment at the yapping furball that was desperate to get at him, and then he looked up at Axel. There was nothing in his gaze but a calm, almost philosophical bewilderment, as if to say, "You hear that too? What a strange noise." He had completely ignored a direct provocation. Mrs. Gable, seeing no bloody battle ensue, hurried away, muttering something about irresponsible owners. Axel was left standing in the middle of the sidewalk. He looked at Bane, and Bane looked at him. And in that moment, the entire suit of armor built from newspaper clippings, horror stories, and prejudice that Axel had worn for years crumbled to dust. It simply ceased to exist. Standing before him was not a dangerous breed. Standing before him was a dog with incredible self-control and patience. They walked back in a different kind of silence. Not a tense one, a calm one. The leash in his hand no longer felt like a tool to control a threat. It now felt like a connection. When they entered the apartment, Bane didn't go to the door. He walked into the living room, circled Axel's armchair, and lay down nearby. Not by the exit, but next to him. Evening settled over the city slowly, blurring the outlines of the buildings outside the window. Axel ordered a pizza, a simple pepperoni, and ate it straight from the box, sitting in his armchair. Previously, he would have locked himself in the bedroom to eat alone, leaving the monster outside. Now, he just ate, watching Bane out of the corner of his eye. The dog lay on the floor, his muzzle resting on his paws. He wasn't begging. He was just there, filling the empty apartment with a sense of presence. It was strange, but no longer frightening. When the pizza was gone and the box put away, Axel turned on the TV. Some bland evening show. He wasn't really listening, just letting the host's chatter fill the silence. His gaze kept returning to the dog. And then he saw it. The battered rubber hedgehog with one eye, forgotten by the leg of the sofa. He remembered seeing it that first night. Back then, the toy had seemed like just a pathetic detail, highlighting the dog's tragedy. Now he saw it differently. It was a bridge, the only object from Bane's past life that was here, in this apartment. Slowly, almost unconsciously, Axel leaned over and picked up the hedgehog. The faded plastic was warm from the air in the room. Without thinking, he squeezed it. A sharp, almost comical squeak cut through the monotonous drone of the TV show. Bane's head shot up instantly. His ears perked, his whole body leaned forward. In his eyes, so calm until now, a fire of recognition ignited. That was his sound. The sound of home. The sound of his woman. Axel squeezed the toy again. Squeak! Bane rose. Smoothly and silently, like a shadow. He took a step toward the armchair. Then another. He didn't look threatening. He looked mesmerized. His gaze was fixed on Axel's hand, which held a piece of his world. Axel felt his mouth go dry. This was the moment of truth. He didn't pull his hand back. He extended it slightly, holding the hedgehog on his open palm. It was an invitation. Risky, foolish, but completely sincere. Bane came right up to him, so close that Axel could see every bristle on his velvety nose. The dog took the toy gently, almost delicately, with his soft lips. He didn't snatch it, didn't pull. He simply accepted it. Then he looked Axel directly in the eyes. And in that moment, Axel understood. Bane hadn't just taken the toy. He had taken it back. The dog didn't move away. He did something Axel couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. He rested his heavy, broad head on Axel's knee, just placed it there, and went still. Axel froze. He felt the weight of that head through his jeans. The warmth, the breath. He looked at his own hand, still hovering in the air. It was trembling. Slowly, so slowly, he lowered it and placed it on Bane's head. He braced himself for anything, for the dog to flinch, to tense up. But Bane only let out a deeper sigh. The short, coarse fur beneath Axel's fingers was warm and alive. He could feel the powerful skull beneath the skin, and the incredible, absolute submission in that simple gesture. He gently stroked the dog between the ears. Then again, the TV chattered on into the void. But all the truth, all the reality of that evening was right here, in the weight of a trusting head on his knee, and in the hand that was finally no longer afraid. The next morning, Axel woke not to his alarm, but to the feeling of being watched. He opened his eyes. A few feet from his bed, on an old rug he'd never paid attention to, lay Bane. He wasn't asleep. He was just lying there, head on his paws, his dark eyes calmly observing the man wake up. He was no longer waiting by the front door. He was waiting here. Axel sat up slowly. There was no fear, no tension, just a quiet, morning acceptance of fact. "Morning, big guy," he murmured. In response to his voice, Bane's tail gave a single, slow thump on the floor. Their morning walk was completely different. The leash lay loose in his hand, almost forgotten. Axel wasn't scanning the street for threats. He was watching how Bane sniffed a bush with interest, how his ears swiveled to catch the chirping of sparrows. They encountered Mrs. Gable and her yapping pixel again. This time, Axel didn't tense up. He just gave a small, crooked smile and calmly led Bane on, feeling like the captain of a great steady ship, ignoring the yapping of harbor gulls. Back home, he tossed the rubber hedgehog onto the floor. Bane, who until that moment had seemed the epitome of stoicism, was transformed. He gave a funny little hop on all four paws, let out a low grumble that sounded like a purring, faulty engine, and bounded after the toy. He didn't just fetch it. He ran back to Axel, dropped the hedgehog at his feet, and then sank into a play bow, wagging his entire body. his hindquarters wiggling uncontrollably. Axel couldn't help it. He laughed. For the first time in many months, he laughed, a real, full-bellied laugh, watching this huge, muscular dog behave like a clumsy puppy. They played for nearly half an hour. Axel threw the hedgehog, Bane brought it back, and each time the ritual was accompanied by a quiet, joyful grumbling. The silence in the apartment had been replaced by life. It was filled with the click of claws on the hardwood floor, the squeak of a rubber toy, and the sound of his own long-forgotten laughter. And then the phone rang. The name of Mrs. Peterson's daughter flashed on the screen. Axel's heart stopped for a beat. He answered. The girl's voice was completely different, not trembling, but happy, full of relief. "Axel, thank you so much. They're moving Mom out of the EQ and into a regular ward. The doctors say the worst is over. I think I can pick Bane up tomorrow evening. You've been such a lifesaver." That's great news," Axel managed to say. His brain registered the information. Mission accomplished. Danger averted. The dog was going home. The first reaction should have been relief. A huge, overwhelming wave of freedom. But it didn't come. Instead, a cold, unpleasant lump formed in his chest. He looked at Bane, who had stopped playing and was watching him intently, head cocked to the side. The dog seemed to sense the change in his voice. Axel finished the call, promising to be home. He sat down in his armchair and stared into space for a long time. He had gotten what he wanted from the very beginning. His apartment would once again be his fortress. Quiet, empty, safe. He looked at Bane, who had picked up his rubber hedgehog again and was chewing it methodically, and he realized one simple, terrifying thing. He hadn't been afraid of the monster in his apartment. He was afraid of the silence that would come when the monster left. The last day was deafeningly quiet. All their rituals, the morning walk, breakfast, the game of hedgehog, were steeped in the knowledge that they were the last. Axel moved slowly, as if trying to stretch every minute. He took longer than usual, cleaning Bane's bowl. He let him sniff the same bush for a full 5 minutes, without rushing him. He threw the hedgehog again and again, until Bane's tongue was lolling out and his sides were heaving. In the afternoon, he did something he hadn't done before. He didn't sit in his armchair. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the sofa. Bane, after a moment of surprise, came over and settled down heavily beside him, resting his head on Axel's thigh. They sat like that for over an hour, looking out the window. Axel's fingers idly stroked the soft fur on the dog's ears. He thought about Mrs. Peterson, about her daughter, about his own stupid, irrational hatred of these dogs. He thought about how much he had missed out on because of a fear that existed only in his head. In the evening, the doorbell rang. It sounded like a scalpel, slicing through their quiet, comfortable world. Bane shot to his feet, his tail giving a questioning wag. He knew that sound. It was the sound of an arrival. Axel stood up, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. He opened the door. On the threshold stood Mrs. Peterson's daughter, a young woman with tired but happy eyes. "Bane!" she cried, her face lighting up. The dog whimpered with joy and rushed to her, nudging his head against her knees. The girl laughed, hugging him around the neck. "I missed you so much, my boy. So much." Axel stood and watched the reunion. A perfect, happy picture. It was exactly what he was supposed to want. He was supposed to be smiling, but he couldn't. He felt like an outsider, a traitor. "Thank you again, Axel."
"You really saved us,"
the girl said, straightening up. She picked up the leash from the side table. "We're forever in your debt." "It was nothing," he said. His voice was hoarse. Bane, hearing the familiar click of the attached leash, turned around. He looked at Axel, a long, intent look. Then he walked over and nudged Axel's hand with his wet nose. Once. It was "thank you." It was "goodbye." The girl pulled gently on the leash. "Come on, sweetie, let's go home." And they left. The door closed. The click of the lock was a gunshot in the deafening silence of his empty apartment. The very same silence he had cherished, which was now crushing him, sucking the air from his lungs. He walked slowly into the living room. On the floor by the armchair, lay an empty water bowl. On the rug, a barely visible tuft of brindle fur. He sat in the armchair, and the emptiness became physical, palpable. He sat there unmoving for almost an hour, and then he stood up. He knew he couldn't live like this. Not again. Bane had taught him something important. Not about dogs. About himself. He went to the closet, got his jacket, and grabbed his car keys. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know if he would be accepted, but he knew he had to try. As he was leaving the apartment, his eyes fell on the table by the door. There, forgotten in the shuffle, lay an old, battered rubber hedgehog with one eye missing. Axel picked it up and slipped it into his pocket. He drove through the evening city without a second thought. He was heading to the only place that made sense anymore, the local animal shelter.